Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, as a Patreon request from Donde Evergreen, I'm talking about the 2004 album from Casino vs. Japan, Hitori plus Kaiso, 1998 to 2001. Alright then, time to get back into Patreon requests, and this is definitely one of the ones I was looking forward to getting to the most. Well, this particular requester sent me a number of different options for what to cover for his request that would probably result in me getting a lot more views than this will, including Animal Collective's Merryweather Post Pavilion and 303's Want. Two extremely different videos those would have been. But his third idea was for me to cover this IDM artist from Milwaukee I'd never heard of, real name Eric Walski, most active in the early 2000s. On paper, that sounds like the least interesting pick I could have gone with. The most obviously in my element of those three, the one that least puts me out of my usual comfort zone, the one that sounds the most like something people would already expect me to recommend to people. But, I mean, you know me, I tend to prefer using this channel to call attention to more overlooked artists. And the more I looked into this guy, the more he intrigued me and like I ought to be covering him. Now, first of all, he's not actually that under the radar. Like, he does have a super dedicated cult following. And not only did some other patrons besides the requester actively urge me to cover him over those other requests, but other people have even requested I cover Casino vs. Japan in my regular comment section without even knowing this was on my Patreon schedule. And as for which album from this guy to cover, the requester did mention that he thought the best starting point to get into him might be his 2000 album, Go Hawaii. That album has been requested by other people too. Though the requester also mentioned that this album, Hitori plus Kaiso, was his personal favorite out of all the artist's work. And I was marginally more intrigued by that one, not only because after previewing through both they sounded pretty much exactly the same, with Go Hawaii seeming to feature less sonic variety, but this album also caught my eye because it's a double album, 29 tracks spread out over 2 CDs, and the 2 discs did appear to have some slightly different approaches to their construction. I wasn't sure whether or not the greater length would be justified. I mean, if it was just 29 tracks of the same stuff over and over, I probably would have been covering Animal Collective in this video instead for the easier views. And for what it's worth, Casino vs. Japan does have albums in his discography that look like they'd be significantly more of a headache to cover. He had an album in 2016 called Frozen Geometry, which had 80 tracks spread out over 3 hours, and from what I previewed through that one, the vast majority of the track listing was nondescript and undercooked 30-second ambient fragments that wouldn't have given me much of anything to say. I'm glad no one requested that one. But Hitori plus Kaiso did in fact look like it would most likely be the most fun and multi-dimensional to listen out of all the projects in this guy's discography. I obviously would know that for absolute certain, as for right now this is the only Casino vs. Japan album I've heard in its full entirety. The other ones I've only, like briefly skimmed through or heard previews of. But as you can tell, I did eventually decide to go through with covering this, and so yes, I did really enjoy this project, and I did think it had enough substance to it as well as justifying its length well enough for me to want to break it down in a full video like this. So what does Casino vs. Japan even sound like? I mean, I did mention he's an IDM artist, but that could mean a lot of different things. So if I had to compare the sound of this album to anything, the one album that most readily came to mind was another project that I covered in a Patreon request last year, that being Gridlock's Formless. There's a very similar mix of warm and nostalgic melodic synths going up next to a lot of big and heavy beat work that fills up the mix, just like that album, but also combine that album sound with Boards of Canada's Campfire Headphase and M83's self-titled debut. There's definitely some very obvious BOC influence going on with the particular textures and shapes of the synths Casino vs. Japan tends to use, ranging quite a bit in warmth and texture. But there are also a number of rock-leaning and shoegaze influences going into the album as well. A bunch of tracks prominently feature guitars to various extents. Not to mention, the particular tone of the melodies themselves, removed from any other instrumental context, being as warm and nostalgia-centric as they are, does give me similar vibes to artists like Ochre or Pilot Red Sun. At least, it's definitely not a stretch to say fans of those artists are not going to have any trouble getting into this as well. Now, I'm not going to say that this is one of the most well-varied and well-justified double albums I've ever heard in my entire life. There is some stylistic running together and redundancy in the track listing with a number of cuts that do feel like filler. I have definitely heard albums that were able to make this nearly 2-hour running time feel like it went by a lot faster than this one. And that does stand to reason, as technically this album was envisioned as a scattered compilation of unreleased B-sides that didn't make the cut for his first 2 albums. Hence the range of years directly credited in the album title. But if you hadn't told me that was the case, I don't think I would have picked up on it myself. It does still feel like a complete and well-realized album in its own right, and that it still comes together as consistently well as it does is pretty dang impressive. Now, in terms of individual tracks, the first disc of the album, as far as I can tell, mostly sticks to the same kind of sound and structuring as an older album of his like Go Hawaii. 12 tracks that mostly run on around 4, 5, 6 minutes each and stick to a pretty similar mix of sounds across the board. Though I do have to say the entire first half of the first disc is really strong. Maybe it's benefited the most from how many repeat listens I've given this whole project over the past several weeks, but there are a lot of neat ideas scattered throughout. Opener Buried hits you with a mix of swinging and bouncing IDM beatwork with tiny chopped up fragments of garbled walkie-talkie voices, building into some very serene and open mixes of synth pads and some other more monolithic and blocky lead chords later on. While most of the other tracks don't have a backbeat this bouncy, it does set the tone for the kind of warm and nostalgic wall of sound approach that the vast majority of the album goes for. Following track Dropsickle strips things down a little bit in comparison with a little more of a tapping trip-hop beat and various layers of dreamy electric pianos floating up and down while keeping the overall vibe just as hazy and summery as everything else here. Border of Your Place features a significantly more hazy mix of ambient pads, but builds lots of heavy and satisfying filtered IDM beatwork on top of it. Search for the Sun features a much more skittering and clattering mix of beats with some much brighter square wave lead melodies that are among some of the catchier and most well-defined leads you'll come across on the whole project. Troidic has all these esoteric reverb-soaked xylophone-like melodies going up against a mix of squelchy percussive effects that sound like the noise made by blowing really hard into a straw in a nearly empty drink. And To Be Roomy is the most intense and banging out of any track up to that point, with the heaviest and most aggressive mix of percussion yet, going up next to these wavering organ-like square wave pads. Definitely one of the moments here that most reminded me of Gridlock's Formless again. The second half of the disc is a little spottier with a few more tracks that don't really stand out as much. See a track like Glossy Triad, which carries right out of the monolithic mix of the previous track, but not hitting nearly as hard. Or the more subtle Relay Goodbye, which acts as the first disc's closer and a mirror to the bouncier beats of Buried, with a lot of radio static and oily buzzing synth bass going up next to its much more gray and downbeat lead melodies. Generally nice, and there is one really pretty section in the middle, but oddly feels like a bit of an arbitrary stopping point for this half of the album. And there's also a 1.5-minute interlude in Rubug, which kinda just sounds like the generic average of all the sounds explored on the entire album, that cuts off before it even has the chance to build into something more interesting. That might even hold the title of most pointless cut out of all 29 here. Although there are still some bigger highlights in the second half of the first disc as well. In fact, what appears to be the most popular track on the album is in this section, Marilyn Set Me Free, which has this really dreamy sample of some kind of chorus of female backup singers from like a 50s pop song going up next to a skittering mix of percussion that almost might resemble a trap beat. This track in particular is near impossible to miss because of how texturally different that sample is from all the synth mixes of the rest of the album. Also reminds me a lot of the band Bent, which I can definitely mess with. I also think the track Bound by Your Smile features some of the strongest melodies in the bunch, combining some plinking leads with some more of the monolithic and cloudy walls of synth, and another particularly thick percussion pattern for a particularly captivating and mysterious dreamlike mix. That one's really solid. And of course there's Wasted Snow Home, which alongside delivering a much happier and more uplifting chord progression featuring a lot of really bright arpeggios that do again kind of remind me of Bent, is most characterized by this one 5-second sample that comes right out of nowhere from like some British kid presumably in some kind of Christmas TV special talking about, "Oh, I love the snow." If this album was ever starting to fall in the background, that one sample would always immediately catch me off guard. I'm not sure if that's for better or worse, but that sample certainly ensured I was never gonna miss this track whenever it came up. Now, the first disc of this album has been all well and good and would have been a really solid standalone IDM album on its own, but it's the second disc where things really start to get interesting. While this half of the album is admittedly markedly less consistent than the first half, with a number of tracks that don't elicit all that strong feelings one way or the other, there is a lot more variety in terms of the sound, not to mention structuring itself very differently. Disc 1 had 12 tracks, but Disc 2 has 17, and a lot of those tracks are much shorter, averaging more around 3-4 minutes, with a load of interludes scattered throughout, once again clearly taking a Boards of Canada-inspired approach. In fact, the disc begins with the most blatantly BOC-inspired cut of them all in Pinwheel, a very mild, minimal synth doodle that only lasts a minute and a half and would have fit right alongside the various interludes on something like Music Has the Right to Children, you know, cuts like Olsen or Bokuma or any of those. Also features a bit of a nice sort of classical-inspired lullaby-ish melody to it. For a solid while we get some of the most texturally interesting cuts on the album all gathered together in a row, all leaving impacts in their own ways despite how short they can often be. The Passing By has a kind of crashing boom-bap hip-hop beat going up next to all these especially mysterious plinking xylophone melodies and synth effects that sound like a lawn sprinkler going off a block away. Tropic is the first cut to obviously build itself around guitars, creating this really laid-back and melancholy ambient subspace out of its distant plucking and very light bass line. Stolen has an equally laid-back guitar-centric approach but brings in a skittering hip-hop beat to underscore it, with the guitars taking on a lot more of a Hawaiian-inspired texture. And Theme from Lazy Day sort of completes this mini-trilogy of guitar-driven cuts but features a bit more progression than the other two, starting out with this super muted and bassy mix of guitar plucking, bringing in the reverb-heavy Hawaiian guitars again for the lead melody, and finally introducing a heavier beat halfway through, all effectively living up to the vibe promised by the track's title. Slow Dance of Dungeons returns to a straight ambient approach with this extremely filtered sample loop that sounds like it comes from some kind of orchestral composition, giving me a little bit of William Basinski vibes, minus the part where the loop gets disintegrated. And then There Will Always Be Love is one of the stranger sounding cuts here too, with all these melancholy and bassy guitar pads covered in tons of reverb going up next to this tapping pattern of dub-inspired percussion. All of these first 7 cuts in the second disc are pretty dang refreshing and keep you guessing where things might be going next. Although admittedly after this point we kind of return to the status quo of the first disc and we get a handful of tracks in a row which aren't quite as texturally interesting as what we got before. Porch Swing brings back the xylophone synths but presents them in the most muted and understated manner yet, over a really simple marching percussion pattern is just kinda there and you could miss it altogether. The mix of simple stomping beats and ascending melodic arpeggios behind proper premonition basically comes off to me as a less memorable and less pleasant retread of what he did on the earlier track Dropsickle, even if there is a cool gradual evolution going through that one. And then Map Happy, while featuring a lot of deep bass lines and uplifting arpeggios, mostly builds itself around a particularly blocky and wiry set of pads. That reminds me a little of my least favorite parts of Marconi Union's Weightless. Also gets a tiny bit repetitive. The only track in this middle stretch of the second disc I might mark as a highlight would be Said Virgo. That track has a bunch of different layers of synth melodies going through its slightly mindless marching beats. The occasional laid-back plucking chords do make for a solid memorable backbone, and there is a consistent sense of movement, despite how understated all the individual elements are. I'd say that one's a grower. But the end of the album is pretty interesting too, because all but one of the last 6 tracks are less than 2 minutes. Just a whole bunch of interludes shoved together that, as abortive as they are, do still all deliver pretty interesting ideas. Well, okay, there is one last major 4-minute track in Running to Catch Up, which kind of repeats some of the marginally more guitar-driven ideas on earlier tracks like Stolen, but presented in an even more hazy and formless manner. That one's nice, but the rest are all tiny interlude fragments which can get marginally more creative, be it the heavily processed high-pitched pianos and distorted beatwork on Ho Hum and C, the 30-second reverb cover Cloud of Harps in Christmas Morning, the dreamy solo MIDI piano performance on Miano Little Miss 1565, one last Boards of Canada style minimal synth doodle in Feeling Fine, as a mirror to the second disc's opener, being abruptly cut off to make way for the closer Night of April, which has nothing to it beyond just another really simple marching beat with lots of super airy and open pads of guitar plucking fading out before even breaking 2 minutes. but as insubstantial as it might look on paper, it actually makes for a surprisingly strong and satisfying closer to the whole album, and the mix, as fleeting as it is very full-sounding and colorful. And that is finally everything on Hitori plus Kaiso 1998 to 2001. I mean, I'm not going to tell you I think this is one of my new all-time favorite IDM records or anything, or like I found it to be anything truly life-changing. I have heard my share of other projects in a very similar vein. Also, this was absolutely not an immediate listen. The first couple of run-throughs I had with this project, all of it near completely ran together, and for like 2 whole weeks I had like 5 tracks written down in the favorite track section because I couldn't tell them apart enough. But the more and more I sat with the album and the more I gave it my full attention, the more I found to appreciate within it. The melodies and textures connected with me more and more, the tracks started to separate from each other more easily. To make the comparison to Gridlock's Formless again, I think at this point, this album may have ended up surpassing that one in my mind. Formless is still an album that entirely runs together pretty much anytime I put it on, which is admittedly directly by design in that case, thanks to having one of the smoothest ever continuous mixes. But being able to tell these tracks apart from each other more easily and the much greater variety on display, while still all obviously belonging together within the same overarching vibe, I think has ended up sticking with me more effectively. Again, I absolutely would never have guessed this is technically a scattered compilation of unrelated B-sides with how well it ended up coming together as a complete album. I suppose your mileage may vary on how easy this album will be to recommend, what with it being nearly 2 hours. It might benefit from taking a break in between the 2 discs rather than going through the whole thing in one sitting, not unlike how I feel on M83's Hurry Up We're Dreaming. And again, I'm told there are better starting points to first get into this guy's work that might work better for other people. Though, for me personally, this ended up being a pretty effective starting point. I am the kind of person who will always prefer a longer album with more variety over a shorter album with less variety, which is more the vibe I get out of an album of his like Oh Hawaii. Not sure if my enjoyment of this album will translate to me getting into his other albums as well. A few of them look like a bit much for me, as mentioned before, but at least in the case of this specific album, I'm definitely glad I spent as much time with it as I did, and I can pretty definitively say that this is something special worth hearing if you're as big of an IDM enthusiast as I am. I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.